it's my pleasure now to introduce another afternoon of really, really exciting sessions. We have 3 sessions this afternoon, starting with our second panel session of the day, facilitated by our VP of Strategy and Corporate Development, Carrie Babcock, and with amazing panelists. We have Rob Wild, partner and MD at L.E.K. We have Ryan Shea, MD of Public, and Raj Mahapatra, Senior Counsel at Wilson Sonsini. Please give them a hand.
All right, hello. Is this working? It is. Yes, perfect. All right, hi everyone. Welcome back from lunch. I have briefed the panelists here today that we've got to keep these takes spicy. Some nice hot takes because I know everyone needs to kind of stay awake post-lunch. I'm Carrie Babcock, as Frankie was saying. I'm a VP of Strategy here at Prolific, working closely with the senior leadership team. Prior to my work here, I've been in venture capital for the last 8 years here in London, and that is actually how I got to know Prolific. I've tried to invest in them. I was just really falling in love with what they were working on, what they are working on, which is keeping the human at the heart of AI development. And then the topic that we wanted to get into today is responding to the AI Opportunities Action Plan. I'm just noticing that's different up on this slide, but that's fine. We're responding to the AI Opportunities Action Plan today. And just a quick show of hands, who here has read the report? Okay. Who threw it into Claude for a quick summary? Yeah, that was actually what you were doing. So yeah, we just wanted to, it was a big piece of policy work that came out about 3 weeks ago for those of you who maybe didn't get into it. It was commissioned by the Secretary of State, Peter Kyle, who's also at the Department of Science, Innovation, and Technology. Not trade, I kept saying trade. And it was written by a pretty influential government advisor called Matt Clifford, who's also the founder of Entrepreneur First. But yeah, I thought it really fit with today's theme of building AI faster, because essentially it's a giant call to action to the UK government to run hard at AI investment and adoption. So the plan starts out by saying that the UK is the 3rd largest AI market in the world, and that it has all the fundamentals for a thriving AI market, a lot of whom are in the room today. I know we've got university talent. We've got leadership we've already heard from the AI Safety Institute. We've got some pretty behemoth tech players in the room as well from OpenAI and from Meta. And the action plan is really saying 3 things. I think Phelan was touching on this a bit at the beginning, that the UK needs to invest heavily in compute and data infrastructure. The public sector, this is what I hope to dive into a bit more, the public sector needs to be a major buyer of AI technology, and that the UK should be an AI maker, not an AI taker. So that's a conversation we're hoping to have right now, the implications of this plan. I gathered together some panelists that have a point of view kind of representing the private sector, public sector, legal perspective. So yeah, thank you so much for joining me. And if you could just introduce yourselves and we'll dive in.
So Rob Wild, I'm a partner and MD at L.E.K Consulting. I do across Europe digital and AI projects. So I'm mainly doing digital strategy, AI strategy, and I also do a lot of transaction work. So raising money for the digital and AI businesses across Europe.
I'm Ryan Shea. I am the MD of a private sector business, but I'll be offering the public sector perspective today, given that we do most of our work with central government, particularly UK central government. So Public was started about 8 years ago as Europe's first accelerator program dedicated to public sector use cases and to startups that wanted to work with the public sector. Since then, we do quite a bit of advisory work, primarily, again, with UK central government as well as governments across Europe.
I'm Raj Mahapatra. I am going to just go back a little bit further. In the 80s, I don't know who was around in the 80s, I was using a thing called Janet. Janet was the, Joint Academic Network. You'll see some nods. Janet and ARPANET merged in the 90s, created the internet. So I can say I was on the internet before it even was the internet. I did my first startup in 95. I then became a lawyer in London, then in New York with the tech boom. I then came back, got involved in a number of startups of 20 years, the last 8 years of which I worked with an AI company focusing on climate change. I then joined Wilson Sonsini. Wilson Sonsini is the original Silicon Valley law firm. We took Google from garage to IPO. We listed Netflix, listed Apple. We work with every single tech company. You know, last year we represented 75% of all US dollars invested in US AI companies. And we represent the companies, not the investors on those things. So that's a little bit about why I'm here.
Great, thank you so much. So the first question is super broad, and it was just really to start to get your takes, your broad reactions to the AI Opportunities Action Plan overall. Did it hit the mark? Is it doable? What were your kind of takeaways here?
I guess I can lead it off. So overarchingly, I think it's extremely positive to see DSIT, a Secretary of State, talking about AI, its relevance to the delivery of public sector services. So I think two elements of it that I love. One, the desire to support the creation of a domestic powerhouse AI market. I think that's absolutely the direction of travel that government should be going in. And the other element of it that I think is really spot on is how can UK government be a market maker for AI solutions, AI tooling. We've seen this in other markets throughout history where government has been the catalyst to bringing technology to commercial and consumer markets. So I think there's absolutely the potential for this. There's no shortage of use cases where AI is going to make a fundamental difference. I think some of the things, and actually one other thing that the report really nails is the mechanisms for improving procurement, tackling that, which is usually a very prosaic subject. They actually take that head on, which I think is really positive. Some of the things I would have liked to see a little bit more of, one around some of the specific use cases, there was a lot of focus on compute. I think if you look at across the public sector from health to energy, there's no shortage of use cases to get people excited about. I think I would have liked to see a little bit more around that, but I think that's coming. There's a lot around technical skills and compute. I would have liked to see a little bit more around how are we building the skills that are maybe not necessarily the data science and frontier model engineering skills, but the skills that a business in the Midlands is going to need to be able to adopt, particularly generative AI. That's really, in my opinion, where the sort of long tail and the value add is going to be for the UK economy. So I think all of these things are coming in the round, but overarchingly, it's great to see that there's this much excitement about this topic area and what it can do, particularly for public sector services.
Do you want to go?
No, I think you should go next.
Yeah, I guess I was semi-positive in the fact that, again, it's good that it's got the focus, it's got the attention. It's very proactive that they basically did this straight after the government came in, and it's putting focus on it. And any focus is good, actually. I would say. I would question a few things. The government is the biggest buyer of digital work. It's the one that can buy massive contracts. It does buy massive contracts at 20 million, 100 million at a time. There wasn't much conversation I would have liked about how they're going to use existing frameworks, existing spend from government to really help AI develop within the economy or help build the skill sets within the UK economy. So I think that was one area that could have done with a lot more focus. And the second one for me would have been, not to sound too negative, because again, it's positive that it happened, but the second one for me would be, it didn't really touch on UK competitive advantage, why the UK would be the place to do some of these things. It was a very generic, let's be good at AI, where in fact, you need to, in my view, we've got some strengths in the UK economy around different sectors, and I always think about the verticals. If it had been more targeted on, we are going to be the best AI within pharma or FS or media, or it doesn't have to be a sector focus, but for me it kind of missed, which you did touch on, too much towards frontier, too much towards build some data centers, not enough around why the UK is special and what we can win at would be my take.
I think it's really interesting. I think the one thing we haven't talked about, I think, and Carrie, you mentioned it, is that Matt Clifford wrote the recommendations, and he wrote 50 recommendations, and the government basically took every single one of those recommendations of how you build an ecosystem. So is it light on detail? Yes, I think it is light on detail. Is it deliberately light on detail? I think it is deliberately light on detail. I think that some of these things you have to work out as you go along, and if you dictate it, especially in AI right now, if you start outlining exactly how things happen, you're going to miss where it actually does happen. You've got to keep it light, you've got to be nimble. You've seen it with the EU AI Act, where they drafted something, and then it wasn't the right thing, and now they're scrambling to make it relevant. And the regulators who wrote that paper say it's the worst bit of drafting they've ever done.
Yeah.
And so, you've got to be able to maintain this nimbleness about things. And the only way you do that is by keeping it light on detail. Now, what I like about it is that it has AI all over it. And that's really important, because if you want people to take it seriously, you need to take AI seriously. You've got to have a government that's taking it seriously. If the government says it's important and serious, they will then take it seriously. They will then invest time and effort learning about it. Universities will get behind it. Businesses will get behind it, because the government is saying AI, AI, AI. If you start watering it down and just talk about technology, AI becomes just part of a bigger picture of things that take it less seriously. So I like that. I like the fact they had some numbers in it. A couple of days later, the US announced their numbers for Stargate Initiative, which are 500 billion, rather than the 14 billion in the UK. But to Ryan's point, it's kind of irrelevant, because we've seen centers of industry shift over the years. It's how you spend your money, not how much money you spend. It's about the infrastructure you build around it. It's about educating people, making sure you've got the right people doing the right jobs. And I think that what you see within the action plan, the opportunities action plan, is enough in it for you to go, okay, I can start seeing where we can start making impacts, and then you've got to lean into it. I'm excited by it. I think it's the right thing at the right time, and there's so many questions still.
Yeah, shall I respond, or do we keep going through? Because that could be a topic in itself.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I agree with the principle that we need to set out kind of guidelines that rather than specifics, but actually if you read some of the recommendations, they're super specific, kind of nominate person to do X, nominate person to do Y, and then some of the bigger actions, it goes back to the numbers behind them, do they make sense, what's the business case, etc. So I agree in principle it's a good thing. I agree it's a good thing, and I agree setting guidelines is a good thing. I think these documents are dangerous because it is quite specific where we're going to focus on AI in some ways, where if you want to be high level, you should be. If you want to be detailed, maybe you should be. But just a view.
I mean, maybe to play peacemaker between the two points of view, because
You're
I
in the
think
middle.
they're both quite valid. So for instance, we do some work with a local council. If you were to go to that local council tomorrow and say, just do AI, you wouldn't get very far. Raj, I think you make a very good point about this is, to some extent, a marketing exercise to say, get people excited about the possibility, but actually the journey is going to be a bit prosaic. And I know that's maybe not the most exciting thing to say at a conference, but there are data assets that need to be matured. You need interoperability. You need standards. There's a very long tail of work that you need to go on to be able to embrace the kind of capabilities that we've talked about in this report. So I just wouldn't want those things to be deprioritized and feel like, I've seen some whizzy stuff from OpenAI, and therefore that's going to just fix government. There are some very, very sticky challenges, but I do like the fact that it starts to get into some of the specifics, like how do you use procurement more effectively? And that is something that not only needs to be solved for AI, it needs to be solved for technology buying writ large.
Yeah. No, excellent. Really, really good points to all bring up. So my next two questions are going to dig into that a little bit more. So there is this common perception, I have a general feeling that sort of regulation is a killer of innovation. But it was interesting, I thought, in this report that Matt Clifford writes, regulations, safety, and assurance have the power to drive innovation and economic growth. And I did reflect on that as, I guess, an immigrant myself over here. I'm American, I've been in the UK for almost 10 years now. And frankly, it reminded me that in that 10 years here, I mean, I came in on a talent visa underneath Tech Nation. And to be fair, the UK government has actually always put, from my perspective, I guess I'm jumping into the debate, it has actually put a pretty big emphasis on the innovation economy and technology as a pillar of the future UK economy. So yeah, just to reflect a little bit on that, is that sort of true what he was writing in that report? Have there been positive outcomes where UK regulation has helped drive technology in this country?
Maybe just to start with like a very high level, I mean, capital markets are a great example of this, where we created a set of rules. Those, you know, if you invested in a business before the kind of modern structure that we have now, you would be at an informational disadvantage. You're not sure if you're going to get your money back. You're probably not going to do it. And we put in place a set of regulations and rules that made it clear, you know, what things were called, what needed to be disclosed, and we didn't necessarily require the government to do all of the regulating. You know, the assurance sector spun up around it, auditors, litigators. So I do absolutely think that there's a historical context to regulation driving growth. Maybe a more modern example of this is the cybersecurity space, where we now have standards around cybersecurity that allow us to transact in a way that's much safer. I think the final example I'd give that's very UK specific is the FCA sandbox for fintech innovations, which, if you remember London in 2015, 2016, I remember this as an American looking at London and saying, wow, all of these exciting fintech companies are coming out of London. And what was, you know, the comparative advantage of London versus, say, in New York? Well, in New York, you'd be, you know, operating with like 6 regulators to get a innovative business model approved, whereas the FCA was giving you the opportunity to get that approval in a much more streamlined way. So I think that's absolutely, you know, the case that you can structure regulation in a way to make it more pro-innovation. Now, we have 90 regulators in this country. I think there's a very real debate to be had about, you know, do we have the right structure for the kind of growth that we want to achieve? But we're certainly seeing steps by government to take this seriously, and we see it day to day.
I think regulation and law are two different things almost to consider here. Law at the moment is struggling. Law is struggling because you can't move at the pace it needs to innovate in law to deal with what we're seeing in technology. So let's put that to one side and just know that that's a struggle. Then you've got the regulators, and the regulators are now struggling because they've got a job to do, which is about protecting individuals. Generally speaking, it's about protecting individuals within who are part of society. So regulators protect society, and now what happens? Now we're looking at a government that's coming out and saying you have to be pro-commerce. And that is an interesting challenge. You have the ICO, which I know from personal conversations with the ICO, that the ICO is the Information Commissioner's Office, in case you don't know. So the ICO is very aware that they have to be pro-business. So they are making decisions based on, let's not stop you from doing what you're doing, but just try to help you do it in a way that's more within what the regulator wants you to do. The CMA, the Competition Markets Authority, was really struggling with that. Interestingly, I think it was the week after the AI Opportunities Action Plan got announced, all the regulators were called in a room together and told, you have to get more commercial. The head of the CMA couldn't get behind it, and later that night, he was fired and he was replaced. And we've now got an interim head of the CMA, chair of the CMA, who's the ex-country manager for the UK for Amazon, and the ex-president of Amazon China. So read into that what you will, but that's how serious the government are taking being commercial within these areas.
That's great.
I guess my only add is, even with that direction, it's still quite regulated as a market. And I guess, you know, the business I work with are generally in the kind of 50 million to 500 million revenue businesses. They've grown really well, but they still struggle with the regulation. And as they expand into different markets, the reason they've been successful in the UK and been able to expand into other markets has often been the environment that the UK has created. So I think we need to push towards a balanced view on regulation. You know, I've worked in banking. I've started banking businesses. I've started a big fintech, and without the regulation being clear and without the regulation who to speak to being clear, it's very difficult. And I think it's just important to keep pushing towards clarity and a balance of commercial versus a balance.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Rob. It's regulation should give you a framework within which you operate and be really clear. If it's not clear, you end up with, you know, a lot more questions. And I guess this is one of your points about the fact that the AI Opportunities Action Plan is light on detail in places and heavy in other places. It doesn't give you necessarily the clarity to operate. So does regulation help give you the clarity to operate? If it doesn't, how do you make sure you get that? I know that we spend an awful lot of time on behalf of our clients talking to regulators to get that clarity. And I know we represent a lot of our clients in those big meetings where you see, you know, Meta and OpenAI being interviewed by politicians about what they're doing. We spend a lot of time behind the scenes there, making sure they're answering the questions in the right way to get the clarity. So I agree with you completely.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. One other thing that the report really reminded me of, and it's obvious when you say it out loud, but that governments are some of the only entities in the world that can actually have the scale and the budget to tender for contracts that are worth hundreds of millions of pounds. And I don't know if any of the builders here in this room today are thinking of trying to sell into the government, but you know, Ryan, I know you wrote a whole report about how to sell Gen AI products into the government. Does this action plan make it easier, speedier, faster, like the theme here, to sell into the UK government?
So the report that we wrote, we basically in the springtime were looking at all of the pilots that were happening across government that were very small, and you know, the logical next step of this was we're going to move from pilot to BAU, you know, more the kind of commercial arrangements and procurements that we're used to seeing. So that's happening. At the same time, the Procurement Act of 2023 is also going into effect, which will go into effect this year. And we felt like, okay, this is a really interesting time to take a look at this sector and say, all right, is there an opportunity to buy generative AI, so more from the government side? Is there a way, are there lessons learned either from the private sector or from across government that we can apply so that we can buy generative AI capability in a better way? And I think we can kind of break our findings down into two buckets. The first bucket being generative AI specific recommendations, which are actually relatively light. So one of the things that we found was that government departments don't count prompt engineering as capital expense. So it means any spend, so what that means is that any spend on generative AI projects would have to come out of revenue budgets rather than capital budgets, which is much more difficult to do. So that was one thing that we looked at, that, okay, this probably needs to be updated. We looked at, I know one of the items in the AI action plan was around the use of contemplation clauses, which Raj is going to be much more knowledgeable on the mechanics of them myself. But basically, we found that there was a fear amongst buyers and government that the technology is moving so quickly, can we make a bet now? Because in 6 months, it might be that token costs are materially different or the functionality is materially different. So this is something that the private sector has thought about before and put into contracts so that buyers can be protected if the state of the art of the technology moves on. There's some specific steps that you need to take when you're going through government procurement, but we sort of outlined those. And then IP ownership is kind of another area which needs more thought as a result of generative AI. So if you're buying something that is, you know, relatively commoditized or the use case is consistent across the market, don't push for, as government, don't push for ownership here, because you're not going to take that IP and commercialize it, and you're not going to be able to work with the best providers of that functionality. Now, if you are building something that is unique to a government use case, that's where actually you have the opportunity to get creative. And can you think about public-private partnerships with the kinds of companies that you want to work with, so that they can get the value out of working with you, but also are incentivized to commercialize? So there were some very interesting things that we needed to think about, but actually a lot of the lessons learned went back to like best practices around digital buying. Engage the market early, talk to the kind of companies that we have in this room, have different ways of evaluating companies. Relying on 10 years of track record and use cases rules out a big chunk of companies that you would want to work with, many of which are in this room. So the report is on our website. Read it if you're interested. Very happy to talk about it. But I'm very happy to see that contemplation clauses made it into the AI Opportunity Action Plan.
I'm actually loving the way you describe that. If I go back 5 years ago, I was negotiating my first contract with my last company, which was an AI company, with the government. And there was nothing that the government understood about working with an AI company, a tech company, really embedded in the way in which their framework agreements worked. So we've spent the whole time negotiating these clauses, which we thought were pretty standard. I've been working recently on the AI framework agreement with the government, and it contemplates a lot of the IP questions, and it says, actually, we don't own it anymore. So they've stopped that fight, which is really nice to see. There's a recognition within that what these things need to look like. The contemplation clauses don't exist yet in the documentation. So we can, if you want to talk about that, we can talk about another moment in time. It's a deep, deep hole we can go down when we start talking about that. So I'm going to avoid that right now, but happy to talk about that anytime.
Yeah, I don't know if I can add much detail to contemplation clauses.
Yeah, no worries. So one of the last questions that I wanted to get into was the 50th recommendation, and what does that mean to you? So it talks about having a UK sovereign AI. The people and countries who make decisions about how these systems operate and what values they reflect, including their approach to safety, will have huge influence over our lives. Hence, the UK must be an AI maker, not an AI taker. I think we were getting into this over lunch, but what does that mean? What are we to take here?
So whenever I hear the word sovereignty, I get a little scared. And I get a little scared because there's this, I don't want to say the word too loud, but Brexit. So you have this idea of sovereignty, and we have the idea that within this multinational, transatlantic, international operating systems, sovereignty actually means something. So let's just park that conversation right now and about the nationalistic behavior that creates sometimes. What they're really talking about is three different things. They're talking about data sovereignty, technology sovereignty, and regulatory sovereignty. And if you look at those three areas, data sovereignty, we have got some of the best data sets in the world out of the UK. How do we maximize the value of those data sets? Then you've got technological sovereignty. We talk about, building infrastructure. Do we need to own that stuff? Well, I mean, the government's thing that we maybe should own some of that stuff. Anyway, I've less said about that, the better right now for me. And then you've got the technological sovereignty. What does that actually mean? Well, we've seen DeepSeek in the last couple of weeks. Do you need the big money to shift technological sovereignty, or do you just need to provide the right infrastructure around it to do that? Do you need to spend huge amounts of money? Actually, suddenly technological sovereignty makes sense, but actually, so that's technological sovereignty. Yes, that's the second point. I'll come back to that one again in a minute. So that's an interesting point. Then you've got regulatory sovereignty, and we've talked about that before, which is actually we've got a history of doing good regulation here and providing the right frameworks in place to bolster communities so they know what they're doing. I think we have a really good opportunity here to lean into that. Now, the big companies are getting together and talking about how do we, if we can't get the regulation in place from the regulators, how do we create our own regulatory systems to try to give us guidelines? And I've always been a big believer in actually, you should just if you are interested in those conversations, just get involved in those conversations because you actually have the power to sway them. However large or small you are, you have a chance to talk about those things. And even in my last company, I was sitting in DSIT, Department of Science, Information and Technology in government, talking to them alongside NVIDIA and IBM about what they should do about AI. And I was just a small startup at the time. So they do want to hear those views, so you can get in there. But sovereignty, ultimately, for me, is about the government saying, there's certain bits of this which we are really good at. How do we make sure that the world recognizes we're good at it and we don't lose that to other countries? So, we've got the skills. We bring people through universities. They are trained up. They are great technologists or social scientists, because that's going to be an important part of this as well. We don't lose those people to other countries because we don't have the right things in this country to keep their attention.
Yeah, slightly different view on, or slightly different framing, I guess, of the question. But there's a number of areas where, we talk about having, where are we a taker versus a maker? And to be a maker, you have to have the skill sets and the people. I'm not convinced about the infrastructure. It'll get built anyway. All the industrial companies are very happy to build infrastructure as soon as you need it, and making quite a lot of money doing so. But the kind of getting the skill sets sitting within this country. So companies we're working with right now, their AI skill sets have been built in Gurgaon. They've been built in Porto. We need to figure out a way that with the big AI skill sets, we're building out the skills in this country and continuing to make it attractive for companies to build out skills in this country. And I do think, especially in the middle, we're not, as a country, yet figured out how to continue to help the mid-sized businesses. If it's a big business, a US business especially, they open an office over here, you'll all celebrate. The Prime Minister will be there with his flag. Ooh, they've opened an office. The headquarters are still in California. No offense to anyone in the US companies. And the small VC company, the small 40 people companies, we celebrate them. They've got to 40 people, they're sold. Great, fantastic. But I really think we need to figure out how, the government needs to figure out how to support, to be an actual maker, needs to figure out how to support the mid-sized companies. And there's a lot of them that are very successful. And I think that's where we will be more of a maker, if we can figure out how to keep the skills, keep the companies, and those companies successful, and within the UK to some degree. I'm not saying don't work collaboratively. And I'll just finish on one point. I go back to set regulation, you don't have to be the maker, actually. I think that's a false point, but we won't dive into that. But I do think to be a maker, you have to have a skill set that's differentiated, and that goes back to what is the UK good at? How do we double down on AI in certain sectors? We could be the leading AI pharma location. We could be the leading AI business services. We really could. Media, all the things around cinema. I really believe that someone's going to have to give me a different solution, but I think we can only win by going on a sector or something in that area, would be my view. Otherwise, we are going to be a taker everywhere.
I'll just be very quick because I think those are really good points. I don't have a ton to add to it. I would say we will do sovereignty right if we are devoting computational power and government resources to things that the private sector is not currently doing today. I mean, the lesson from DARPA and the successful entrepreneurial state use cases are that when government invests in things, basically that scientists and people who are good at something need, but where there's no market, that the market tends to follow. So if we use our sovereign AI capability to do that, then I think that we will be successful. I think we'll not be successful if we're just playing arms race with US West Coast companies and saying, me too over here. And trying to do what the private sector is already doing. And I think, reading the report, I do believe there's a risk of that. That to me would be what good looks like and what not good looks like.
I actually completely agree with you. There is this risk that it's, I think the line that Keir Starmer used when he announced it was, we want to take on Silicon Valley. And actually, that's the wrong attitude in my mind. It's not take on Silicon Valley. It's about saying that actually we can own things in a very different way. What we mean by take on is we provide the right infrastructure around businesses so that they can have their own version of Silicon Valley here in Europe, here in the UK, that they can have the infrastructure with the investors, with the tools, the data sets, everything else that environment lends to. I think if you get too hung up on being to take someone down, you're going to miss the opportunities.
Totally, and just to add on to that, you know, the NHS is an amazing data asset, and we talked about this a little bit over lunch. Now, there's huge information governance questions around that need to be solved, but you know, could the UK be the destination of choice for founders that want to build solutions that are targeted to single-payer systems? Like, that's an open. I think that's an open goal, really. You know, the U.S. that's just not the U.S.'s market. So there is an opportunity there, and I think it aligns to what the action plan is focused on, which is how do we use public sector assets to be able to direct energy towards things where we have a genuine competitive advantage. So that, and you know, we certainly need solutions in that space desperately as a country. So that's what I would like to see more of.
Amazing. Gentlemen, I think we're perfectly on time, but yeah, thank you so much again for joining us. I think that was a really rich discussion. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.